Tonight we've got our last session of this series entitled Metaphors, Magic and Mystery. Whoa. So we all know that Buddhism is this really rational tradition, which is what attracts many of us to it. But in this series we've also seen that Buddhism, the Dharma, goes beyond the merely rational. Our universe is much richer and stranger and deeper than our little rational minds can take in. And all too often we just live on the surface. We just live on the surface of things. We fail to live the deep, meaningful lives that we could live, that we have the potential. And all too often we justify this shallow living by what we think of as being rational, by, well, nothing could exist that I haven't got experience of, that sort of limited pseudo-rationalism, assuming that we already know it all, and assuming that just living the lives we're supposed to lead, the lives that society tells us to lead, being a good consumer, etc., contributing to the GDP, this is the purpose of existence. Being kept happy by bread and circuses, like the Romans. So, all too often that's how we live. But the universe is deep, and we think that's rational. We can think that's rational. But the universe is deep, beyond our comprehension. Life is deep. We ourselves have depths that we're not usually aware of. And the Dharma is rational, but it's about those depths as well. In fact, it's mainly about those depths. Goes beyond our limited common sense reason to open up a vision of the world, a vision of life, a vision of what we are, and a vision of what we could become, which goes way beyond our limited present experience. So over the last few months, we've been exploring the way in which the Dharma explores these depths, exploring the way double exploring. We've been looking at the way the Dharma explores these depths. And involves the depths of our being. And last week, in the second to last talk in this series, Bodhinaga gave a talk called Wisdom from the Depths. It might have been called Wisdom of the Depths, but I thought it was... Anyway.
Dark.
Sorry?
Wisdom in the dark, isn't it?
Wisdom in the dark. Okay, well, never mind. I'm going to rename it Wisdom from the Depths, because that's what I thought it was called. Anyway. So what Vadanya talked about was the way that our rational conscious mind is just a small part of us. So he used the analogy of an iceberg. And we all know the part of an iceberg that we can see, the bit that's above the water, is actually just a really small part of the whole thing. Most of the iceberg cannot be seen. It is down there in the dark depths of the ocean, outside of our knowledge. And we are very much like that iceberg. One of the insights that the early psychologists and psychiatrists like Freud and Jung have given us is that our conscious mind is just a small part of our being, rather like the tip of the iceberg. And that most of our being, our psyche, whatever you want to call it, is like the rest of the iceberg, out of sight. We can't see it, we're not aware of it, it's down in the dark, it's subconscious or unconscious. And there can be ugly and stuff down there that we don't want to know about. But it can, what Vadanya talked about is the way that it can also, there can be wisdom down there, it can give us wisdom. We can get wisdom from the depths or the dark that our conscious mind sometimes doesn't want to know about. So my talk tonight, in a way, is going to take that idea a bit further. Well, illustrate that idea. I'm going to illustrate that idea with a story. So yeah, just a little bit more about the iceberg. We can't see this part of us like the ice, which, like the iceberg, is below the waterline, but it has a huge effect on us. It has a huge effect on us. Very often our drives, our volitions, our urges, and what the early psychologists called complexes that are down there, they push us around. They push us around. They control our actions. So we use an analogy for this on our intermediate course, which most of you will come across. We talk about ourselves as being like a horse and a rider. So a horse and a rider. Rider is the conscious mind, the rational bit. The horse is the rest, the big bit of the iceberg below the waterline. And we think we're the rider, and we think we're going over there. But the horse is going over there. Very often the horse is going towards, it might be going towards all sorts of things. Very often it's going towards attractive horses it finds sexually attractive. A warm stable and a full nose bag. That would be a rational horse. Irrational horses might be going for all sorts of other things, heaven knows what. But the rider thinks, a better world, enlightenment, full nose bag. And it's very often obvious to see with others, but we're completely blind to it. The unconscious is unconscious. We really don't know about it. We think we're great. A very important part of our Dharma practice involves becoming aware of this horse, befriending it, learning to speak to it, getting it on our side, getting it on the side of the more rational side of ourselves. Meditation is a very great help in this. When our mental chatter dies down, we become aware of deeper levels of our mind. Some of our unconscious becomes conscious if we are willing to let it speak to us. And as well as so, that aspect of practice helps us, but as well as meditating, we also need to learn to talk a language that communicates to our depths. And it's not a language of reasoned out words. It's the language of images, myth, poetry, ritual, music. A language that includes magic and mystery, which is why Buddhism speaks in those languages as well as the language of reason. But okay, a lot of the stuff that is down there below the waterline in our unconscious is there because we just don't want to know about it. Well, actually, a lot of it's down there because we don't want to know about it. One reason we don't want to know about it is because we all think we're nice chaps and chapesses. We all think we're nice, don't we? But we all have feelings and thoughts and desires that do not fit that image, that are really not nice. All of you. We all have feelings and thoughts and desires that they don't fit the nice chap or chapess image at all. So we push them down into the unconscious. No, I'm not like that. I don't do that. Below the waterline. They don't go away. They don't go away. They just often rule us from the shadows. But at least we can keep up our idea of ourselves as nice that way. And one of the things that often happens with spiritual practice is that we discover we aren't so nice after all. We discover that we have drives that we need to own up to and work to transform so that we could use that energy for something positive rather than just be ruled by it from the shadows. That very often happens in spiritual practice, that we start out thinking we're wonderful and we end up realizing we're not quite so wonderful, actually. So sometimes we push a part of ourselves down into the unconscious because it's a bit ugly. And we don't want to see it. But there can also be other reasons that our unconscious mind does not want to know about something and pushes it down, which connects with the wisdom of the depths. Maybe there's something, this part of us, if we let it out into the light of day, it would make us see things we don't want to see. It would give us wisdom we don't want to have. Because it would be inconvenient. Because it would be inconvenient for the way our conscious mind has chosen to live. because maybe the way our conscious mind has decided it wants to live, which seems to it safe and comfortable, is in fact making us unhappy. And maybe part of us knows that. So, the conscious part of us thinks this is a good way to just avoid suffering. This is a good way to avoid suffering. And part of us knows that that is not working. That is not going to work. Or maybe part of us knows that actually it's demeaning. It's beneath us. It's not worthy of us, the way we're living. So part of us knows that the way we're living is causing us suffering or is beneath us. But it seems to us safe and comfortable. So we don't want to know. We don't want to know at all. We don't want to hear that truth because it would mean we would have to change. And change looks scary. And change looks uncomfortable. Something inside us sometimes knows that we are stuck. We're in a dead end, and if we carry on this way, we'll gradually wither away, actually. We need a sort of spiritual death and a sort of spiritual rebirth. Our present self and way of life has to, in a sense, die so that something better can take its place. And our present self does not want to die for obvious reasons. Of course it doesn't. So it pushes that part that might bring the threatening good news, pushes that down into the dark, where it can't be seen, so we don't have to change, below the waterline. So we sometimes push down our own wisdom, if that wisdom is threatening to the sort of comfortable accommodation we've made with life. So, as Bodhinaga told us last week, there can be wisdom in our depths trying to speak to us. But all too often, we don't want to hear this wisdom because it doesn't feel comfortable and it doesn't feel safe, because it would mean that the way we are living would have to change. There are loads of examples in the Buddhist tradition of this sort of wisdom erupting from the depths and changing people's lives. There's loads of examples of that. They're often told in this really mythic way through figures of one sort or another. So sometimes these figures involve these sort of horrible hags, they look like witches who come out and poke people with sticks and say, "Oh, you're going to die. You're going to die. Do you know that? Are you practicing?" But actually that's enlightenment. That's something in us that we don't want to see. Or these figures are dragons or demons from the deep that then turn into handsome princes and princesses when we acknowledge their existence. But before we acknowledge their existence, they look really threatening. Sometimes these stories involve divine angelic figures that give spiritual advice, but that's only when the person is receptive to that advice. But tonight, I'd like to tell a story from our culture, that illustrates the same thing in quite a dramatic way. It's a story that fits in very well with the theme of metaphor, magic and mystery, because it's a sort of ghost story. And it's supposed to be a seasonal festive talk, so... Scrooge. I'm going to talk about the story of Scrooge, the Christmas Carol, okay? All right. It's a bit close to sentimentality at times, especially when made films of. It glorifies Christmas, which in our time has become a tacky consumerist extravaganza. That's two reasons not to do it. Third reason to do it, I've told it before twice. But actually, I didn't want to do it, but the centre team insisted. And okay, you can see the film. I think the film's on every Christmas. But films aren't a great way of getting at internal truth, actually. They don't bring across the internal dimension of the story. And in fact, this is a very wise story. A very dharmic story that illustrates a lot of dharmic truths, some of which are not obvious, and which certainly aren't brought out in any film version. So I hope you'll bear with me, even if you've heard the story before. So our story starts by introducing us to one Ebenezer Scrooge, a character whose very name has passed into our language. Scrooge is what we would call a successful businessman. He's a successful man. He runs a business and he makes a lot of money. So he's a successful man in the terms in which our society measures success. He does well at his business, has plenty of money. Of course, what he's famous for is being obsessed with money and very reluctant to give it away. Dickens describes him as a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner, hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck out a generous fire, secret and self-contained and solitary as an oyster. The cold within him froze his old features, nipped his pointed nose, shriveled his cheek, stiffened his gait, made his eyes red, made his thin lips blue, and spoke out shrewdly in his grating voice. He carried his own low temperature always around with him. He iced his office in the dog days of summer and didn't thaw it 1 degree at Christmas. So Dickens' metaphor for Scrooge's inner state is cold. Okay, cold is the metaphor he uses. Scrooge is the very antithesis of the warm, positive emotions. He's the opposite of the emotions that the Dharma tells us that we need to cultivate in order to connect us to other people and the world around us, to open us up to the experience of reality, which is an experience of connectedness. So Scrooge is cold, and Scrooge is shut off because he's shut off from the positive emotions, so he's also shut off from others. He's trapped in himself. So Dickens says he's self-contained and solitary as an oyster. He's the opposite of connected. So the Dharma tells us that we exist in relationship to others and the world around us, and we need to be connected rather than cut off if we're going to live a true life, a life in accord with reality. But Scrooge suffers from the delusion that he is self-contained, enough in himself. He thinks it's a virtue to be concerned just for himself and not for others. So when some charity collectors come around collecting for the poor, he tells them it's enough for a man to understand his own business and not to interfere with other people's. So he thinks being about for yourself is a virtue. He's sort of the ultimate individualist. So he's trapped, cut off from others, the opposite of connected. I mean, he's got no positive relationships, really. Dickens tells us nobody ever stopped him in the street to say with a glad look, "My dear Scrooge, how are you? When will you come to see me?" But what did Scrooge care? He edged his way along the crowded paths of life, warning all human sympathy to keep its distance. So, he's cut off and he likes it. He thinks, he's an individualist. And he's also really materialist and rationalist and cynical. So by materialist and rationalist, I mean he only values what can be seen and measured. He values just the surface of things. He doesn't recognise anything behind the surface. If you can't see it or sell it, he doesn't think it exists. He doesn't rate it at all. So when his nephew wishes him a Merry Christmas, he very famously replies, actually something I'm so tempted to reply, "Bah, humbug." Bah, humbug. And then he goes on, "Merry Christmas? What reason have you to be merry? You're poor enough." But his nephew is more than a much for him, because his nephew replies, "What reason have you to be dismal then? Dismal then, because you're rich enough." So, to me, Scrooge seems to be very much in keeping with the spirit of our times. The message we are bombarded with is that the way to be happy is to be rich. Look after number one and be rich. Being rich as an individual, rich as a nation, is the secret to well-being. So we have to sacrifice everything to economic growth. Economic growth, having more money, having more stuff, is the key to human happiness and well-being. That's what we're told. We don't seem to have noticed that we are already rich enough, like Scrooge. That seems to have escaped our attention. It's really noteworthy if you go to somewhere which is a lot poorer. Like go and visit some of our brethren, our Buddhist brothers and sisters in India, and people in the UK on the dole are rich compared to most of them. And they are loads happier than most people in the UK. Something wrong here somewhere. Something doesn't compute about this material wealth equals well-being. Because actually we've already got enough. We're already rich enough. Why are we dismal then? As an order member wrote in Shabda, our sort of order magazine, order newsletter, he just spent some time, quite a long time, working with an NGO, a voluntary organisation among disabled people in Nepal and living with a Nepali family, very poor Nepali family. And he found them just really pleasant and really nice and really quite happy folk. And he sort of forgot what the UK was like. And then he said he arrived back at Heathrow. And he thought, my God, there's been some sort of disaster that I haven't heard about that happened on the flight. Maybe there's been a nuclear bomb gone off or something. Because everybody looked so unhappy and stressed. And so he went and got a newspaper, and there was nothing had happened. And he thought, what he said in his reporting in Shabda was, I realised I was in the midst of a society in the grip of a collective neurosis. And having to have loads more stuff as part of that collective neurosis. So, Scrooge, our society, parallels. We don't seem to have noticed that we're already rich enough. Why are we so dismal? Anyway, so although it's Christmas Eve, and according to the way that society thinks, it should be the season of goodwill to all, Scrooge is thoroughly nasty to everybody. So he's thoroughly nasty to his nephew, who invites him round for Christmas dinner, but he refuses. He's thoroughly nasty to his clerk, his poor put-upon clerk, Bob Cratchit, who he hardly pays anything. He's thoroughly nasty to the charity collectors who come to his door collecting money for the poor. He says to them, are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses? And if some of them die, well, that will reduce the surplus population. Which is quite rational, really. So he's all rational, he's all reason, he's got no empathy for others. He's a materialist rationalist living on the surface of things, cut off from any depth. And then, as a very cold, frosty, foggy Christmas Eve evening falls, Scrooge makes his way home from his office in the gathering gloom. And it's just about dark as he gets home. And in the gloom, something from his depths erupts into his narrow conscious mind. Wisdom from the depths begins to erupt for Scrooge. And he doesn't want it. He doesn't want it. It is very unwelcome because it might disturb the way of life that his conscious mind finds safe and comfortable. So it comes in a very unpleasant way. What happens is, the first inkling of this is in the gloom, he reaches out for his doorknob. And instead of his usual doorknob, he sees the head of his old business partner who's been dead these past 6 years, Bob Marley. Not Bob Marley. Jacob Marley. Jacob Marley. He'd be like Richard, it's Bob Marley. Jacob Marley. Anyway, he reaches out for his doorknob, and instead of his doorknob, in the gloom, he sees the head of his dead business partner, Jacob Marley, who's been dead these past 6 years. So he recoils, shock and horror. Ah! But then he reminds himself that he is a down-to-earth rationalist. Probably says, bah humbug, nothing exists except the surface layer of things. So he collects himself together and opens the door. Nothing. And then he double locks the door, because thinking like a good materialist rationalist, he thinks that double locking the door is going to keep what is bothering him out. But then when he gets into the hallway of his big, empty, dark, gloomy house, he thinks he sees a hearse with a coffin going up the huge, broad staircase. And then when he gets into his big, dark, gloomy living room, he sees his huge innate fireplace, which is carved with all sorts of figures. And each figure seems to have the head of Jacob Marley, his dead business partner. And then a bell starts to toll. And he hears the clanking of chains, as though someone is dragging chains across the floor. And Jacob Marley's ghost appears before him, looking very miserable and all wrapped up in chains and dragging chains. So, I mean, all this stuff about death and the appearance of a ghost, we could say, is the eruption of some wisdom about reality from the depths of Scrooge's mind into his conscious awareness. Impermanence. Impermanence is a fact. Death is a fact. We will all die. This is a reality. And in the light of that reality, all of Scrooge's material success and all his money start to look completely meaningless. No defense whatsoever against the nature of things. But Scrooge still tries to protect himself with his old defense of cynical skepticism. So he even tries to make a joke of it. He says that a vision like this is nothing more than the result of a bad dinner. So he makes a joke and he says that Marley's ghost smells more of gravy than it smells of the grave. So he's trying to make a joke of it all. But whatever it is that is appearing to Scrooge as the ghost of Jacob Marley is not going to be put off. So whatever it is tells Scrooge that the reason he is wrapped up in chains is because of his self-centered life, because he lived such a self-centered life in which he didn't care about anyone himself. So he is doomed to wander in chains. And he says, the chains are of my own making. I made them link by the mean and selfish way that I lived that life, and now I have to drag them around. I wear the chain I forged in life. I made it link by link and yard by yard. I girded it on of my own free will, and of my own free will I wore it. So here's another bit of wisdom from the depths erupting into Scrooge's conscious awareness, and this is the wisdom of the truth of the law of karma. If we act unskillfully, in a way that cuts us off from other people and reality, we create fetters and manacles and chains for ourselves that we have to wear. We have to carry around. We make them link by the way we live our life. We make them link by each and every one of our actions. Whereas, of course, if we act skillfully in ways that connect us, we gradually weaken and dissolve the manacles and chains that bind us, and we gradually become more and more free and more happy. So Jacob Marley's ghost tells Scrooge about the reality of the law of karma, or we could say that the reality of the law of karma is wisdom that comes up from his depths and he doesn't want to know about. Comes up in the form of this ghost and confronts him. So the ghost, or whatever it is, says to Scrooge, I've come to warn you. Would you like to know, he says, the weight and the length and of the chain you wear? Because it was just as heavy as mine when I died 6 years ago. and you've been adding to it ever since. It is a very heavy chain. He says that Scrooge has spent a long time making just the same sort of chains for himself. And he warns him that unless he changes his life, he will face the same horrible fate, doomed to wander around as an unhappy spirit, dragging the chains he's created by his actions. And he also says you'll be forever doomed to regret the wasted opportunity that you had to do something positive while you were in this world. So Jacob Marley's ghost, or whatever this represents in the depths of Scrooge's own awareness, he forces Scrooge's conscious mind to face some realities. Firstly, the reality of impermanence and death that he would rather forget, and the reality of the law of karma, which he would rather not know about. And it also points out that he has a precious opportunity and that he will regret it forever if he wastes it. So those of you who have been around a while, you might recognise 3 of the 4 reminders here. There's what are called the 4 reminders, are 4 reflections in Buddhism that people are encouraged to do to really sort of give us a sense of why we are following the path. The 4 reminders are the precious opportunity, that we have a really precious opportunity as human beings to do something meaningful with our life. Another reminder is the reality of impermanence and death. We will all die. And the third reminder is the law of karma is a fact. The law of karma is not a theory, it is a fact. The way we act determines the person we become. And the person we become can be somebody who is wrapped in chains if we're not careful, as it were. The 4th reminder is that what we might call unsatisfactoriness, dukkha, even pain, even suffering is inevitable in life. It cannot be avoided, and the attempt to avoid it is just going to... the attempt to avoid it, what it often does is it makes us cut off from reality. So we need to learn to face it and live with it. And suddenly it's not so bad, actually, when you act like that. So, funnily enough, very dark, isn't it, that whatever it is that erupts into Scrooge's consciousness tells him about 3 of the 4 classic Buddhist reflections. The fact that we have a precious human rebirth, a precious opportunity, the reality of impermanence and death, and the law of karma. The 4th one about the existence of suffering, the inevitable existence of unsatisfactoriness, is implicit in quite a lot, and we'll see that it comes in later as well. Anyway, so out of concern for his old business partner, we're told, Jacob Marley gives him this terrible warning. We could say out of concern for Scrooge, his own debts give him this terrible warning. Tells him he's got to change the way he lives. And he says, you will see 3 more spirits this night, which might bring this change about. And then something completely in character with Scrooge happens, because Scrooge is all reason and out of touch with his emotions and his depths. So he says, well, you've already warned me. Can't we do without the 3 spirits? It's as though he's saying, well, I know this now. I know this with my head. You know, what's with the 3 spirits? You know, you've given me the warning. I know I've got to change. What he isn't taking into account, of course, is that that change is just in his head, and we are our depths. This change has got to go much deeper than that. This change has got to affect all his emotions. This change has got to be a depth charge into his depths. In a way, it's got to almost break down his defences, his rational defences. And what's happened yet hasn't quite done that. So he needs the big experience that he's going to have. He will see 3 more spirits. In other words, he's saying, I know with my head what you're telling me, that's enough. He doesn't realise. He's a very, very shallow man. Marley's ghost, or whatever it is, tells him it doesn't work like that. There won't be any real change unless he experiences what these 3 spirits are going to make him experience. He needs to know in his depths. He needs to be moved in his whole beings. It's not enough to know. And sure enough, in the course of the night, 3 different ghosts appear to Scrooge as he tries to get some sleep. Or we could say the eruption of wisdom from his depths continues in 3 different phases through the course of the night. So the first ghost, the first eruption, appears at 1 in the morning. And it's called the Ghost of Christmas Past. So the ghost says that he wants to show Scrooge some things from the past. But Scrooge really does not want to know. Scrooge does not want to know. He resists. He's almost kicking and screaming, resisting. He doesn't want to know. He's not receptive, as we would say. And an interesting little side here is that the ghost starts to give off light. And Scrooge tries to sort of cover him up to stop him giving off light. Light is like awareness, isn't it? Light is symbolic of awareness. The covering up of the light is quite symbolic of, I do not wish to be aware of this. So he kicks and screams, but in the end, the ghost, as it were, takes him by the scruff of the neck and it takes him on a journey against his will. This is very much against his conscious will. He carries him out into the night over London, over the surrounding countryside, until he gets to a landscape that he remembers from his childhood. And there, in that landscape, he's taken down into a house and he's shown a miserable young boy, poor and lonely and neglected, sitting reading by himself. And he sees that that is him. And he feels compassion for himself, for the suffering that he experienced as a child. And somehow this immediately turns into compassion for other children like the child he was. So he gets an uprush of regret and shame for having turned away just like himself, a child just like himself, who came begging to his door looking for food. So that, in a way, is the first bit of wisdom. He has suffered. He has suffered. This is really... He realises that he has suffered and he gets compassion for himself, his own suffering. He's also shown his sister, who died as a young adult, and he re-experiences his fond feelings for his sister. It's as though getting some compassion for himself has opened a floodgate to other feelings. And then he's shown himself in his very first job as a very young man, and his close friend Dick, who he felt really close to, he felt really a lot of friendship for. He re-experiences that. And he's shown his very kind employer, Mr. Fezziwig, a very Dickensian name, and he remembers the kindness of his employer, the kindness that his employer showed to him as a young adult. And he feels this strong uprush of gratitude. So it's as though connecting with his own sufferings, realising his own suffering, has connected him to others. It's connected him to others. He experiences compassion, he experiences metta, he experiences gratitude. So yeah, it's as though something has been pushed down. He's been pushing emotions down into his unconscious and letting them out as they've come out as a piece, as it were. It's as though there are emotions that he doesn't want to recognise, the emotions of almost the recognition of his own suffering, and those have been completely stopping him experiencing emotion. So when one comes out, they all come out. That is what seems to happen. It's as though it opens the door to empathy for others, compassion for the suffering of others. When he lets out one emotion, they all come out. So acknowledging the suffering, the ghost then vanishes, but it seems like acknowledging the suffering experience as a child and the arising of some human sympathy for others who suffer like himself, memory of warm feelings he's suppressed to protect himself and his gratitude for the benefits he's received. All these have really kicked off a big change in Scrooge. They've gone to the depths. They've been like a depth charge. So when the next ghost appears, the ghost of Christmas present, Scrooge is actually open to what it has to show him. He's no longer just needing to be dragged by the scruff of the neck. He's now open. The emotional change has caused quite a big turnaround. So the ghost of Christmas present appears. And so I say Scrooge is open to what it has to show him. Basically, what the ghost shows him is other people enjoying Christmas. Or rather, what he shows him is other people enjoying their close relationships with others at Christmas. So he shows him the joy of positive emotion, the joy of relatedness, the joy of connectedness. He shows him especially people who he thinks he is better than, because he is rich and they are poor. So he shows him his poor nephew that he said bar humbug to. He sees him with his friends and his fiancée, and he sees them laughing and joking and really happy in each other's company. And he sees his poor, unprepossessing clerk, Bob Cratchit, who turns out not to be quite so poor after all, because he has a much richer life than Scrooge, because he is loved and he loves other people. So he sees other people enjoying something that he's totally cut off from. And worst of all, hardest to take of all, he is shown himself as these other people see him. He thinks he's better than all these other people. And what he sees is that these other people, far from thinking he's better than they are, because of his wealth, they feel sorry for him. They feel sorry for him because of the way he is cut off from human relationships and from positive emotions like metta and joy. And this is very difficult for him to take. So there's a spiritual death going on here. He realises that the self, in a way, the self he's been inhabiting, is a complete monster, a complete prison. It's not even doing what he expects it to do, which is to get respect. So, there's a really strong spiritual death going on here, and there's a sort of preparation for a spiritual rebirth. So finally, and this is finally finished off in the last watches of the night, the third spirit appears to him, which is the ghost of Christmas yet to be. The third eruption from his depths. He sees his own death and the legacy he leaves behind him. So he sees the important businessmen who he thinks of as his peers and his colleagues, the people whose respect he wants and who he expects to respect him. He sees what they really think of him. One of them says it'll be a very cheap funeral because nobody will go. And another one says, maybe I'll go because there'll be a free lunch. He sees that he has no friends in the world, nobody who regrets his dying, and that all his possessions will go to other people. He sees himself dying alone, lonely, miserable, and he says of himself, well, this way of life has brought me to a rich end, truly. And in desperation, he asks the spirit if there's anyone who regrets his death. And he's shown a couple who owe him loads of money and are about to be evicted from their house. And they're really glad that he's dying. So he sees the future after his own death. He sees someone else in his chair, in his office, everything carrying on as it had. No evidence of him except a gravestone overgrown with ivy that nobody can care to look after. And it's very bleak. And then he genuinely thinks he's dead. That's one of the things about this. He really thinks he's dead. He thinks he's seen the future and he's dead. But then dawn comes. And as dawn comes, the ghost of Christmas yet to be morphs into his bedpost. And he realises that he's still alive. He really thought he was dead, so he's just immensely relieved. He's had a reprieve. He's been given an amazing opportunity. He still has a chance to do something to change himself and his impact on the world. He says, I'm light as a feather. I'm as happy as an angel. I'm as merry as a schoolboy, as giddy as a drunken man. A Merry Christmas to everybody. Happy New Year to the world. Hello, whoop. I don't know what day of the month it is. I don't know how long I've been among the spirits. I don't know anything. I'm like a baby. Never mind, I don't care. I'd rather be a baby. Whoop. So he's had this profound emotional experience leading to a spiritual death and a spiritual rebirth. He sends a turkey to his clerk, Bob Cratchit, by taxi. He gives a large sum of money to the charity collectors he had mocked earlier. He goes to his nephew's house for Christmas dinner and has a thoroughly enjoyable time. He is completely changed. He is reborn as a happy man. The text tells us he becomes a good friend, as good a master, and as good a man as the good old city knew, or any other good old city. Some people laughed to see the alteration in him, but he let them laugh, and little heeded them. For he was wise enough to know that nothing ever happened in this globe for good, at which some people did not laugh. His own heart laughed, and that was quite enough for him. Okay, it's exaggerated, but it is a story about an eruption of wisdom from the depths, causing a spiritual death and a spiritual rebirth, and emotional transformation leading to a complete transformation of being, really. So, how can we be a bit... we're not, I hope, like Scrooge, not quite so cut off, but I think we all, to some extent, hold down wisdom that might be a little bit inconvenient, that might ask us to change our comfortable, what seems like a comfortable way of living that our conscious mind has chosen. What can we do to listen more to the wisdom of our depths? So I've got a few suggestions. So one of the first things that happens to Scrooge that really causes the depth charge in his being, that triggers what seems like opening a door to his emotions, is acknowledging his own suffering as a child. We all suffer. We all have suffering in our lives. Very often, we don't want to go there. We just do not want to go there. We don't want to admit that. Pushing it down, not acknowledging it, can just deaden all our emotions, actually. Now, I'm not counselling a sort of massive self-pity, but I think a lot of people have trouble with the first stage of the metta bhavana, feeling good about ourselves. And I think acknowledging our own suffering, particularly perhaps our own suffering as a child, could be a way into that. I think there's quite a lot of wisdom in what happens in the story. And I have to say that one of the things I used to do, I don't do it anymore, but when I was sort of getting into the metta bhavana, one of the things I found useful was precisely imagining myself as a child in certain situations where there was a lot of suffering, and feeling compassion for myself. And that compassion that I felt for myself as a child led to compassion for myself as an adult and to compassion for other people. It opened doors to feeling. And I think it's not at all rare for us. Maybe it's a man thing or a women thing, I don't know, but I don't suffer. I'm strong and big and don't suffer. And that tends to deaden feeling. So without getting all sort of, oh, poor me, I think just acknowledging our own suffering there's a lot of wisdom in that, actually. It's the first thing that really breaks out for Scrooge. And what that does is it opens the door to positive emotion. And positive emotion is really the driving force for the sort of spiritual transformation. The positive emotions, they're connected to our depths. When we're in just the surface level of our minds, we're out of touch with our emotions. Our emotions connect us to our depths. So doing the metta bhavana connects us to our depths. The metta bhavana is a really important practice. And doing the metta bhavana and acknowledging what we feel, and working with what we feel, rather than pretending, it's a way to connect to our depths very strongly. Another thing that happens to Scrooge, of course, is that he remembers benefits received. He remembers his first employer and the benefits, how good his first employer was to him. And that can also open emotional floodgates. We do this, don't we, on our intermediate course. We do our gratitude exercise where we just write down people who have benefited us. And I think that's a really powerful practice. I think it's a practice that we could all do more than once. We could maybe do it quite a lot because it does put us in touch with these positive emotions and they do open up our depths to us. Something else we could do is look at be willing to look unpalatable truths in the face. So Scrooge is presented with some unpalatable truths. What are unpalatable to the way we try to pretend life is. In the form of 3 of the 4 classical Buddhist reflections. This precious human life, we've got this amazing opportunity. We can waste it on trivia. We can waste it on trivia. We can waste it doing all sorts of things that have absolutely no meaning whatsoever. We need to do something useful with it or we will regret it. We will regret it really badly. So we've got this precious opportunity, let's use it, not just spend our life in distraction. The unpalatable truth of impermanence and death, they're a fact. When we recognise that they're a fact, we get real about living. As long as we think we're going to live forever, what does anything matter? I'm going to live forever, aren't I? So I might as well just waste time and whatever. Impermanence and death are a fact. They make us get real and they also give us a sense of connection to others because others are in that boat as well. There's a quote from the Dhammapada which says something like, when we realise we're all going to die, we resolve our problems, our quarrels. We resolve our quarrels. When we realise that we're all headed for death, we resolve our quarrels. How can you keep up stupid sort of quarrels and grudges and resentments when we know we're all going to die? What's the point of that? Karma is a reality. Everything we do matters. How scary. That's a really unpalatable truth. Dissatisfaction, pain, suffering is inevitable. Society doesn't tell us that. Society does, we can get away with it. But it's not, it is. And as long, if we face that, life becomes actually a lot more manageable. So very often our conscious mind simply does not want to accept these truths and sort of builds a phony picture of the world in which we live. And as in Scrooge's case, it's the depths know the truth. The depths know the truth, and let's allow the depths to speak. And very, very finally, do things that let the depths speak. Okay, so the depths will not speak if we are constantly on our mobile phone. The depths will not speak if we are constantly got input on Facebook, whatever. Forget it. The depths need quiet. So meditation allows the depths to speak. Silence allows the depths to speak. If you want to be radical, something that committed Buddhists do, solitary retreats, go away for a period, spend time completely on your own meditating, and guarantee you the depths will speak. Absolutely guaranteed the depths will speak. Take 2 weeks out, go somewhere in Wales where there's nobody around except sheep, look at a wall, and something big will happen. But of course we don't want to do that, do we? We'd rather just carry on. So let the depths speak, and that does require us to sort of step out of the usual mould. So those are some ideas so that the depths can speak and we don't end up completely cut off from them and in a total dead end like Scrooge. Thank you.